Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. We have a fantastic panel here today, and I don't think we can be discussing a more important topic. After Minneapolis, is the US a failed social experiment? I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of the panelists today and from all of you. Open Democracy is a global media platform. We do awesome investigative journalism that seeks to challenge power and inspire change. So very much relevant to the topic we're going to be discussing today. And thank you to all of you who are joining us and all who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to try and address as many of them as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, if you have a question or comment, you can click on the chat icon and type into the chat window. If you're joining from Facebook, you can add your input, it'll be fed back. I will add the normal health warning. This is informal discussion under lockdown or semi-lockdown. We may have unscheduled interruptions from kids, from pets, from any number of distractions. So apologies in advance if that happens, and please bear with us. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair for the panel today, Lola Olufemi, who's author of Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. Thank you so much, Lola, for joining us, and I'll hand over to you to introduce our panel and kick off the discussion.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name's Lola, I do some writing and some organising in London. And I think this conversation that we're about to have emerges from what has been constructed as a seemingly singular moment, which is the death of George Floyd no less than 2 weeks ago, and the resulting kind of riots, uprisings, revolts that have happened because of it across the world. And we're here to answer what I think is a very simple question, which is America a failed social experiment? I think its settler colonial history tells us that it is, but what I hope our speakers will be able to do really well is to break open that question and enable us to think about all nation states as failed projects. And the ways in which they create and perpetuate conditions of disaster everywhere, especially in the age of COVID and especially in the age of a global pandemic. And I think most importantly, how that failure everywhere comes to be understood and mediated in relation to America's preeminence as a global power. So I'm really, really honored to introduce our speakers. We have Rasna Warah, who's a Kenyan writer and journalist, who currently writes and edits for The Elephant, an online publication based in Nairobi. We have Zoe Samudzi, who's a writer, PhD candidate in medical sociology at the University of California, and a fellow with the Political Research Associates. And we have Aaron White, who is the North American economics editor for Open Democracy. So how the conversation is going to go is I'm going to allow the speakers 5 minutes to kind of reflect on the question. And then I'm going to ask some questions, and then hopefully there's going to be lots of time for audience participation. So Zoe, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, hi. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think that when we're thinking of the question of whether something is a failed state or a failed social project or not, I think it's really important to think about the kind of political subjectivity, to think about who is speaking about the project. I would say that if you are an architect of settler colonialism, it is structurally quite a successful project, right? There is an ongoing, will never be rather, successful genocide of indigenous communities, ongoing dispossession of indigenous land, of violent suppression of Black life, of Black existence, of Black resistance, a maintenance of what is now disaster capitalism. Because it has not been fully undermined, it has not yet failed from the kind of position of the people who are invested in maintaining it. But I think that if you are indigenous, right? If you are Black, if you are poor, if you are disabled, if you are trans, if you are any one of the identities that in order for capitalism to reproduce itself, right, are subjugated as a worker, are excluded as a citizen in any way, I think that it's not even so much a matter of, is this a failed project, as was this a project that was ever constructed to succeed for you? And so we have to kind of think about its origins as well as its trajectory over the past couple of centuries.
Thank you for that. Rasna, would you like to go next? I think you're muted. You're muted, Rasna.
I think the events of the last few days have exposed the fault lines in American society, and it's come at a time when, you know, there was a perfect storm of the coronavirus pandemic, which had a huge human toll in the United States. It came in the economic shock caused by the pandemic, which resulted in job losses. And then to add to this, George Floyd being killed by a white police officer, which opened up old wounds. Plus you had a presidency that is completely clueless and dictatorial. So it created a perfect storm for the riots of last week. The fault line, of course, which America has never been able to resolve, is the original sin of the transatlantic slave trade, which festers up to now and has never been addressed sufficiently, not even by, I would say, the first Black president of the United States. And this original sin, until you address that issue of what the slave trade meant for American society and why Blacks continue to remain the scapegoats and the punching bags of white America, is something that has to be addressed. And I think I really wanted to talk about how the events in America have also highlighted that there are many George Floyds, even in Africa, who are unrecognized and not mourned. I read a statistic this week issued by the Independent Police Authority, which does oversight over the police in Kenya, and they found that 15 people had been killed since the 27th March curfew in Kenya by police. So police brutality has been normalized. Extrajudicial killings are quite common in Kenya, but nobody's mourning those deaths. So I would like to stretch the conversation over to the continent of Africa, where I would say the colonial model has been adapted or adopted by the neo-colonial governments, which have who use the similar kind of, which allow security forces to use brute force to keep people in line. So I would like that the conversation move in that direction as well, to show that this trend of Black people dying at the hands of police and at the hands of a state that is not committed to the citizens, but is committed to global and local capital, is what's making Black lives very vulnerable, particularly young Black men who are killed in great numbers in Kenya. So that was my contribution.
Thank you for that.
To think about, yeah.
Rasna. Aaron, would you like to go?
Yeah, so I'd like to discuss a little bit just how the last couple of months have really revealed who wields the power in the United States. And if we begin with the coronavirus, it was demonstrated just how much power the state has, with the ability to essentially shut down capitalism in the United States, and the ability to close schools, for example, and on a scale that we haven't quite seen in many generations. And then on top of that, it's demonstrated who those in power truly represent. So the initial economic response to the crisis was obviously to give big businesses almost unlimited amounts of money. There was a $500 billion slush fund that had gone towards them, whilst very little was done for those who are poor and those who are on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And then that has now translated into kind of an optical milestone to demonstrate the cruelty of the American empire, Obviously, what we've seen now are the hard infrastructures of military brute force being used on Black and brown communities in the United States. Everything from drones that were engineered in Israel and have been used in the Middle East are now being used in the United States. There are reports of drones circulating around Minnesota. There are tanks in the streets, which many of which were designed in Iraq, which are now also appearing in the streets of the United States, which we saw in Ferguson and in other kind of uprisings that we've seen over the last several years. But then what we've also seen is the brute disposability of our system towards Black and brown lives and towards poor lives. Obviously, that was shown in the coronavirus. Here, I'm based in New York, and we saw mass graves on TV. And finally, now it's being shown with the killing, the lynching of George Floyd. And I think one of the themes that I've been thinking a lot about is the optics, but then also this notion of surveillance. So essentially part of this military apparatus has been the surveillance mechanisms, whether it be through these hard military forces or will it be through corporate surveillance. And now what we're seeing now is I think we're seeing a battle of surveillance where people with their iPhones now are documenting the police while the state still wields this incredible amount of power to oversee the general population. And in terms of if this is the end of the American experiment or American empire, I would say that it's going to determine who has the power. Right now, obviously, we have a neo-fascist in the White House, and that is just going to extend the white supremacy and the hard military power that's going to be inflicted on the general population. And we will see if these uprisings can really wield some kind of real political change and systemic change.
I want to kind of pick up on what Zoe said specifically about how the idea of a failed or successful state depends on who you are, and to think about the suffering that has caused this moment, the suffering that is proliferating during this moment. Thinking about how we might displace the idea of America as a global hegemon as a kind of resistance strategy, but not its citizens. So not displace the suffering that we're seeing, not displace the kind of the anger and the rage that is underpinning this moment, and how that might allow us to think across borders and to think across, to make links between failed states. Zoe, do you want to come back on that idea?
Yeah, I think that Rasna is completely correct, right? Like what we're seeing is not just the kind of the failure, the kind of moral, political, structural, social failure of the United States, but the fact that there is no such thing as a nation state that is not inherent with the idea of exploiting, of commodifying, of brutalizing Black life. And so what we have seen in Kenya, we've also seen in Uganda, in South Africa with the recent killing of Collins Kosa and so many other folks by the South African National Defense Force and the South African Police Services. I think that for me, the issue is not so much how we reform the police, but it's understanding, because you cannot reform the police as long as the structure of the nation state endures, right? Because in order for a nation state to exist, it has to maintain a monopoly on legitimate violence. There is no contesting the state that the state understands outside of an attempt to undermine the monopoly on legitimate violence. So there is no such thing as a peaceful protest. There is no such thing as nonviolent civil disobedience, as long as it seeks to in some way displace the kind of tendrils of brutality. And so I think the thing that has been the most interesting for me has been the kind of internationalism that has arisen out of this moment, not simply other countries being in solidarity with the United States, because I don't think that that's completely necessary, because there are the structure of anti-Black violence is international, even outside of the United States, which is consistently held as being exceptional, and it's not. I think it's been really interesting to see the ways that connections are being made, that people are yes, thinking about what's happening in the United States, yes, thinking about the kind of export of American democracy building and values, but also the colonial legacies within which their own efforts are existing, within which the violence that they experience is existing. And so I think that along with the really important calls of defunding, of dismantling, of abolishing police here in the United States, I think it's also really important to think about the understanding of the demands that we have around police alongside the way that we understand the function of the state. Because we cannot be safe from state violence as long as the kind of the core of statist repression continues to exist.
I wonder also, Rasna, if you could speak to even like the idea or the concept of the failed state, and what that means in African contexts where the state is always already imagined as a failure in the Western imagination, and so that allows the kind of construction of a certain kind of exceptionalism where we see what we imagine to be a functional state in the US kind of crumbling with the death of specific people, but other states that we already imagine as failed projects, right? We're not able to, the optics don't carry in the same way. We're not able to register the same kind of level of anti-Black violence by the state in those contexts. So I wondered if you could speak a bit about the context in Kenya, and especially how it is compounded by the virus.
Well, a lot of Kenyans are joking that, you know, finally America got its American Spring, and that the scenes that we're so familiar with, you know, of military or police beating up people, and kind of scenes that are very familiar in Africa of people dying in hospitals or lack of hospitals. It seems to have, those images are now American images, and it comes as a shock that the world's, you know, wealthiest nation could be experiencing what many African countries have experienced, and which are reported as such by the Western media. So people are also joking that, in fact, now maybe Western journalists should turn to African experts on failed states to describe what's happening in America. It's it seems to be like an upside down world at the moment. The issue, I think, is talking of failed states. You know, we often refer to Kenya as a plantation economy, in the sense that there are the people who own the country, and the workers, and the people who help the owners get rich. We've never transcended that plantation economy, even after independence, and it's becoming more apparent that, in fact, the state doesn't even have to use violence anymore against the people, but it can just institute laws that repress, you know, the media, for instance, or which impose punitive taxes on the people, or legislate in such ways that the people's voices are not heard. So the failed state, as we imagine Somalia or other places to be, has been transformed into a more, I would say, corporatized state where the rules of society benefit the few rich. That's why it's okay in Kenya. That's why it's poor lives don't matter. That's why it's okay for a homeless man who was shot dead by police this week because supposedly he was breaking the curfew. he had nowhere to go, he was on the street, is okay, and nobody raises it in the media. Nobody protests against this illegal act. So I think we have to think about it in terms of economies and who is benefiting, and which are the players which continue to exploit these states. They may appear like democracies, but they're also moving towards repression, but in a way that remains slightly invisible. So they don't have to use brute force. They don't have to chain people and make them work, but they can impose punitive laws that don't allow people to express themselves or allow people to even break through poverty. For me, it's an economic question, and it's not simply the nation state imposing its will on the people, but right now I think corporations are ruling the world, and they set the agenda for what leaders of countries do, and we have to be very aware of that. I think Donald Trump is hostage to those forces, and his alt-right agenda is being implemented through the tactics he uses. People like Cambridge Analytica, for instance, which was also involved in the Kenyan election, who are playing, psychological warfare with people's minds, and changing the way countries are run. So for me, that's a very dangerous trend, and Donald Trump just epitomizes that.
I wondered also, Aaron, kind of building off what's already been said, if you could talk to the reactions to the destruction of private property and the kinds of acts of looting, the acts of stealing that we've seen, and how that has caused the kind of pearl clutching, not only amongst liberals, but amongst people who would call themselves members of the left, right? And what that says about how this failed state, or what that says about how America tries to maintain its status quo, in that property is valued over Black life.
Yeah, I think it harkens back to what's kind of been circulating on Twitter and social media a lot about what we mean by looting, what we mean by stolen. I mean, if you see that 40.7 million people have now filed for unemployment in the United States, but billionaires have now increased their wealth by $485 billion. And they're obviously with the coronavirus going on right now. But then it harkens back to before too. I think when we talk about the looting that are going on in these stores on Fifth Avenue or in Soho, it's important to keep in mind the global supply chains that make this all possible, and the exploitation of the workers that make the clothes, but then also the workers who are also selling these clothes and are working in the retail industry, who are getting paid minimum wage salaries. So I think when we talk about this discussion about private property, it's evident who those in power are trying to represent and whose interests they are protecting. You even see this now explicitly here in New York as well. You have the NYPD now proclaiming war on its population, essentially. And the justification for that are these looters that are being shown on TV, that the right-wing media and the establishment media as well is so fixated on when they're covering what's going on in this country right now. So I think it's important to keep in mind the structural mechanisms that have really looted from the poor within this country for so long, whilst the rich get richer and richer.
I was wondering if I might add something about the comment on looting and property. I think that there's something that's really interesting that's happening about this distinction that's being made between legitimate property damage and the kind of opportunistic looting. Because to me, I don't think that there needs to necessarily be a difference. I think that there is something that gets really interesting when we look at protest, especially when we look at Black protest, something really interesting about the kind of constraints that people put onto the demands that Black people make for our liberation. And when I hear these comments about looting or about property damage, and in the same breath that people are saying Black Lives Matter, what I hear is a caveat, right? Black Lives Matter, but Black protest matters unless you. And I think that it's really important to remember that in this country, there has been a very particular relation, or a very particular identity that comes attached to property ownership. That when the Constitution was written, within the original boundaries of citizenship, you could only be not just a white male, but a white land-owning male. And you have Cheryl L. Harris writing about how whiteness is property. And this exists obviously within a political context of, transatlantic slavery, where Black people literally were property. So when we're talking about looting, I think there's something interesting about this idea of taking this dispossessed, or of the formerly, of a disruption rather of this proprietary relationship between whiteness and Blackness and the state, right? I think that we needn't try to think about this respectable idea of what is legitimate theft and what is looting, because, as Aaron said, all of the wealth that is being made is plunder. All of the billion, like, you don't become an almost trillionaire like Jeff Bezos by practicing ethical business. And I think that we need to stop being so precious about property. Especially, in the way that we're seeing like police stations burn down in I think Fayetteville. They burnt down they tried to set fire to a building that was formerly a slave market. That not only, unfortunately there's like retail and mom and pop shops and whatever, but there is a literal burning down and looting of the physical edifice and structure of coloniality, of white supremacy. And I think that the symbolism and the material reclamation, for me at least, it's certainly not lost.
I think, just to extend that point, I think we also see with this idea of caveats, how those caveats have been applied also retroactively to the 2011 riots that happened to in the UK, in London, and even the possibility of riots in London now, right? We see an entire kind of commentariat class who put themselves forward as kind of liberal, free thinkers, etc. But when it came down to it, they were willing to risk nothing, right? They were willing to put caveats on the revolution because some instances or some actions were deemed as going too far. And I think that has to do with a wider kind of lack of imagination in terms of what we understand revolution to be, right? Like, revolution is messy, it's incoherent, it means necessarily the destruction of everything. And I think that the destruction of everything asks us all to risk something. We all have to give up something. And a lot of people, especially obviously white people, in the way that this kind of world is structured around kind of anti-Blackness, are think that they're ready to give up something, but really they're not. I think I also I wanted to ask about kind of, I guess, going back to the idea of optics, when we begin to make connections across states, right? And when we recognize that Black life is under threat everywhere, what does it then mean to structure our responses, even our activist responses, around epicenters or around catalysts or around moments? And how can we kind of open up that specter of Black death in a way so that it isn't contained in a single geographical location, so that it becomes impossible to root it somewhere such that states might then be able to frame themselves as exceptional? Does anybody want to come back on that?
Well, I think in Kenya, we could have capitalized on George Floyd's death by demanding that the police here be accountable for all the killings. And I'm not talking about one or two killings, because there are organizations that have recorded, documented hundreds and hundreds of killings, particularly of young males living in the slum areas of the big cities, particularly Nairobi, and are never held to account. Now, if, there were some murmurs of maybe African Union protesting Floyd's death and demanding that, America treat Black people well, but there is silence on why is it that the poor lives don't matter in Kenya. So that was an opportunity lost. I think which actually reflects another trend, which is the sort of clamping down on civil society organizations in Kenya, co-opting the opposition. So right now we have no opposition in the country, no party that will stand up to the government. And so, we've been silenced. This was an opportunity to fight police brutality in Kenya, and we lost it. By linking up that brutality with the one here and making the connections between, making it an issue that shows that actually the violence is structural. And then, unless you dismantle those structures, it will continue. Police brutality will continue to be a form of suppression used by the state.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to come in?
The question, could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
What does it mean to kind of structure our ideas of, to structure what's happening around the ideas of catalysts or epicenters or specific moments, and how do we open up timings, essentially?
Okay. Yeah, the idea of catalyst is really interesting, right? Because it's in having conversations with friends, right? There's both a deja vu and this like really jarring moment of witnessing where it feels like we're seeing something that we've never seen before. But what I think is important is to kind of refuse these really clean linear periodizations of kind of history and of protest, because I think a big part of the way that I think about kind of contemporary US history, at least in the past 20 years, is this kind of pre-Ferguson, post-Ferguson. And what it looked like for political organizing, what it looked like for consciousness raising, when we saw what happened around Michael Brown's murder, even a couple of years after seeing Trayvon Martin's murder and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. I think that I get a little bit nervous about the idea of an epicenter because of the way that it kind of reinscribes kind of the primacy of Blackness in the United States. Because there are so many different parallel and intersecting and overlapping processes of dispossession and violence that are happening around the world. I think a lot about the migrant crisis in Europe, and the images that I saw of like Black migrants that were coming from Africa and dying in the Mediterranean. I think about the killings in the favelas of Black folks, of Afro-Indigenous environmental activists in Latin America, and Black, Aboriginal folks in Australia and New Zealand. And I kind of worry that the way that events are historicized, the timelines that create, that start with the killing of George Floyd, kind of elide so many other ongoing processes and so many other ongoing efforts that that kind of made, not wax and wane, but kind of go in and out of the news. And I think that what maybe is significant about this moment, it's the kind of confluence of what's happening with coronavirus and the way that it became so impossible to refuse to see the kind of necropolitical functioning of the state. Like the way that as soon as racial demographics started getting released about who was dying, that's when the protests to reopen the economy really started. When you know, we're still seeing people not getting their unemployment, when we're having to literally beg politicians for something more than a one-off $1,200 check. It's like, there is obviously, yes, something significant, because like, how fucking bad does it have to be to risk getting tear gassed in the middle of a pandemic, of a pandemic for a respiratory disease? So on one hand, I don't want to say that like this is the watershed that changed everything, but there are so many things that made this moment so ripe for protests. That's, yeah.
I think also what you're saying, Zoe, makes me think of how this is not obviously only a failure of the nation state or of carceral systems, but it's also a failure of healthcare systems. And it's also a direct result of like an austerity logic in terms of human life, right? And a kind of, Ruth Gilmer says this thing about the doctrine of least eligibility in terms of how we understand who deserves to be cared for in any capacity. Just because I want to get to the other questions, I want to come to the kind of last question, which touches on what you were talking about in terms of the ideas that Black people right now know. They know the risks. They know, especially in this country, we're having loads of conversations about the risks of protest, the risks of arrest at this specific moment because of the virus. And I wanted to talk a bit about abolition, the abolitionist kind of underpinnings of this particular moment, and what they ask of us as people invested in livable futures, as people invested in more ways of living that don't require the dispossession and exploitation of specific people for the benefit of others. So yeah, I wondered if maybe Aaron, you start, if you could speak to a kind of abolitionist principle or an abolitionist logic that is structuring this moment. So what do we mean when we say abolish the police? What do we mean when we say we could live without policing? We might be able to live without prisons.
Yeah, I think this is when I think a lot about agency and really reclaiming the agents of the mass population. I mean, if we look at our political system right now, we see that both parties basically play towards the same constituents of the monopoly capitalists, and we have people now who have no electoral outlet in the system right now. I think that's why this anti-systemic critique is so hard to this movement right now, is because partly is people have been so disengaged from the political process and so disillusioned from the political process. So I'd say that a lot of it comes with the power of collective solidarity, and again, with reclaiming the agency.
Zoe, do you want to speak to that?
I think that for me, abolition, oh God, I don't even know where to start. It means a lot of things. I want to think about what Miriam Kabe says when, you know, she says that abolition is what it means to work towards a world where we don't need to have prisons. I think I'm completely ruining the quote, but it's the kind of ethos that we are actively working against, an ethos of disposability, right? Like the ideology and the materialization of the idea that anyone or any group of people needs to die in order for a system to be sustained, which is the nature of racial capitalism in the United States and around the world now, that poor people need to die, that the people who are less valued as workers, you know, disabled people who are chronically ill, can almost be offered as collateral because they are not sufficiently contributing to a state, right? Like that entire that entire structure is what we are working against. We are thinking about the idea of care, right? And as opposed to this idea of exploitation. It's about mutuality. It's about communalism. It's about kind of refusing carceral forms in all of the ways that they creep up, whether it's, it's the hospital, whether it's the way that in the UK, universities exist as another means of enforcing immigration, in the way that people's first instinct when they see something wrong happening is to kind of to self-deputize and to call the police. This is what I see fundamentally. To Erin's point about agency, mutual solidarity. I see so much imagination. I've seen so much imagination, right? Because the abolitionist movement is not new to this moment, but I'm in the ways that it is specifically articulating demands for the police around defunding the police, around eliminating relationships between police forces and high schools, elementary schools, museums, and other institutions, to think about a way of living and a way of being that does not force us to continuously rely on the police to structure order, right? And to structure safety, which always comes at the expense of racialized people, of poor people. That to me is really exciting. Sorry.
I think it also makes me think of that Jackie Wang quote about how the prism is a problem for thought that can only be unthought if we refuse to capitulate to the realism of the present. And I think what that means in the context that I'm in is like a refusing to cower to an electoral system or the lesser of two evils, or anything that wants to plug the possibility and potentiality of this moment, right? That is exactly what abolition asks us. It asks us to think beyond the given, to think beyond what we have been told is already possible. I just so that we have time for audience participation, I want to move on to some of the questions. And there's a question here for you, Rasna, somebody asking about how class structures in Kenya can basically obscure or elide things that are going on in terms of protest, right? So if you belong to a particular class, it might not seem as if there is active protest on the ground, but working class Kenyans have an idea, are actually using their agency to fight back and remain critical of the government. So I wondered if you could speak to how class kind of stops what we can see or enables us to see some things over others.
Well, I think class is very much entrenched in Kenyan society, including in civil society organizations and NGOs who reflect that class structure as well. I know that there are a lot of movements, for example, dealing with police brutality and extrajudicial killings in the informal settlements in Nairobi, for instance, and people who are documenting these killings are doing that at great risk to their own lives. In fact, some of them have even been arrested or intimidated in ways. I'm not suggesting that there is no protest in Kenya, but I'm suggesting that the tools that the poor, whatever you want to call the poor, use are not effective in a system that is designed for the rich. So kind of that is why it's very rare to find a kind of Arab Spring kind of uprising in Kenya. People are divided not just along class lines, but also ethnic lines. There's gender, and it becomes very difficult to mobilize people around a single issue. It's happened in Kenya, but very rarely. It happened when Kenyans demanded for a new constitution. That new constitution is slowly being eroded under the current government. The basic tenets of that constitution are being undermined by various laws that negate the constitution. And so, you know, the kind of the protest that would allow a kind of revolution here that the conditions do not exist. So there's always a division, a class division that is then perpetuated by the political elite, which design laws to keep the poor poor and to suppress any kind of opposition or resistance. The curfew at the moment is a perfect example of how the state has used its resources to introduce new laws, and even carry out a mass eviction of 5,000 people, which normally could have, and made them homeless at the peak of the lockdown and the curfew, knowing full well that there would be no protest because people would be in their houses self-isolating, or because they're afraid to be killed by the police if they disobey the curfew. So what I'm saying is that the state can use even a pandemic to undermine resistance. Yeah.
Thank you. Just so that we have time for questions, I've got two here. So the first is this the beginning and the end of the US empire? And we've got another question that says, do you think that the reason many people are seeing this as a cataclysmic moment is because white people finally seem to show some outrage towards anti-Black racism? If so, is there kind of a relationship of gatekeeping there? So if anybody wants to speak to any of those questions. Go on, Zoe.
Well, I personally hope that this is the beginning of the end for the American empire, right? That this is the death knell of empire. I think that I'm a bit worried about when the president said that he was going to federalize the kind of state and local responses in calling in the military. I think that as much as it would be exciting if this was just like, oh, empire, we're done, it's crumbled, bye-bye. The thing that happens with any empire before it crumbles is that it even more brutally represses. And so I'm trying to be careful about like tempering my desires, because I know that there are people who will be harmed, and people are going to be killed, and people are going to continue dying under coronavirus. And if the state clamps down harder and surveils even harder, as seems to be the case, it's going to get worse. So I'm kind of, holding those two things simultaneously. And then your second question, one more time, I'm so sorry.
The question was about people seeing this as a crucial moment because they're finally waking up to the reality of anti-Black violence. I guess it's more about a question of a relationship of gatekeeping, right? Like,
I don't know if I think that this is people waking up to the reality of anti-Black violence necessarily. I think that I think that it's kind of a gatekeeping in that there is a classed understanding that is like helping people to segue to the racial understanding. Unfortunately, we're not just getting to the point of like capitalism being sustained through anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and xenophobia and all of these other kinds of racisms, but it's, how many tens of millions of people have recently filed for unemployment. I think that this is a moment in which maybe people are waking up to anti-Black violence, sure, but also there is enough economic and financial stress across racial lines to some extent that it is enabling people to develop a much more critical understanding of the state. And developing that critical understanding of the state means that they have to acknowledge the fact that the state exists to produce this anti-Black violence. So through this maybe economic understanding, people understand that like the maintenance of capitalism means that Black people have to be killed, whether or not it's the police or it's these structural and geographic and other conditions that force Black people to be essential workers and force them into these low-wage labor roles where they are more vulnerable to coronavirus and less able to stay home and all of these other things. Although I tend to be cynical about white people's capacity to kind of grasp and to be really honest about racism, I would be very happy to be wrong on that front.
Aaron, do you want to come in on that question? Or?
Yeah, sure. Just building upon what Zoe just discussed, I think when we talk about is this the end of American empire, I think we need to be very wary of kind of a law and order backlash, especially electorally, that seems very, very possible in this current situation right now, especially with people with echo chambers and people really living in their different kind of virtual realities. I also think it's important to think about, when we talk about kind of tools of subversion and the fact that the state has obviously monopolized violence, and this is now on full display throughout the United States, it's important to think about what other tools that the population has at its disposal to go against the state, whether it be mass strikes, rent strikes, student loan strikes, kind of going after all of those mechanisms that are designed to kind of keep people in check and keep people in line. And then I think we need to think of, again, about kind of the commons and where we communicate and how we communicate and who mediates that communication. Right now, a lot of what we're seeing online is mediated through these private entities like Twitter, which the state also has access to. So I think if we're really thinking about going beyond, and if we really are talking about a revolution, we need to recreate some kind of online commons if we are stuck in this coronavirus era right now. So there's just some ideas, yeah.
Amazing. I think we're going to have to wrap up now, but I just wanted to give the opportunity to our speakers to kind of say one or two lines in closing if they want to. I'll close by saying thank you. This has been an incredibly generative conversation, and I'm thinking about what it means to think against and beyond the state at the same time, and also disaster as condition, like the idea that we're constantly living in a state of emergency. So if people want to kind of very quickly round off their thoughts.
Okay, I'll go. I think I just want to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates, who said that white America is a syndicate arranged to protect white power and privilege, which are used to dominate and control Black bodies. I think one of the big people things that white America is terrified of is Black rage. And perhaps we talked about gatekeeping, perhaps that the fear of that rage is what is now waking up white Americans to the fact that there is actually an insurgency in their midst. The question of will America crumble? For me, the question is, if America does crumble, then what will replace it? Will it be China, the new superpower? Should we be worried about that?
Thank you, Rasna. Zoe, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just want to hold close and encourage others to hold close when Fanon wrote that violence rising up against the oppressor is both cathartic and self-actualizing, and that we needn't whittle down our rage, our voices, our international solidarities in order to be respectable, because there has never been a revolution that was respectable.
Aaron?
Sure, I guess something that has come up recently was that talk by Cornel West, and he says that the system cannot reform itself. And I think that one thing that we need to focus on, especially in the midst of an election cycle, is can we rebuild trust in electoral politics and kind of change the direction of the Democratic Party and give people a sense of hope that it is actually possible to deliver of like the material needs that the population so needs right now.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And I really want to just echo and end on that idea of an abolitionist politic, and end on that idea of, I guess, a need to think critically about ideas of reform, thinking critically about ideas of the state, etc. So I'm going to hand back over to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was absolutely powerful and moving discussion. So I'm really grateful to all of you, and I'm really grateful to everyone who participated and asked questions and added really thought. I'm always really inspired by the thoughtful commentary you see alongside these panel discussions. We had participants today from the US, Spain, South Africa, Israel, Germany, Italy, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Amsterdam, Namibia, Poland. So this was a really, truly global conversation. And thank you all so much for taking part. If you haven't already, please do sign up to our newsletter. We are specifically monitoring the crackdown against democracy and human rights across the world that's happening during coronavirus, and how authoritarians and other oppressive regimes are using this moment as an excuse to crack down all over the world. So you can do that at opendemocracy.net/corona crackdown. And we send you updates and bulletins every week about precisely these issues. The other thing to say is it's really tough being a journalist at the moment, and our industry is under enormous pressure. And if you enjoyed this conversation and you think that that conversations like this should continue happening and journalism should continue to hold power to account, and you have the means, please consider making a voluntary donation to Open Democracy, which is support.opendemocracy.net/donate. But most of all, thank you to the fantastic panel, and I really hope we all continue this conversation in our communities, with our friends and families and in our networks. So thank you all for joining.